It is August 1914. In East Africa, at El Mentiita Station Yard, Hugh Cholmondeley, 3rd Baron Delmere, is on his way to Nairobi. He will eventually be crucial in coordinating British and local Maasai relations throughout what will be known as the Great War. As he is at the station, a rather rough fellow is near him, a local game warden that he knows very well, Charles Joseph Ross. Hugh informs Charles that the British Empire that they are both citizens of is now at war. As Hugh boards his rail car, Mr. Ross smiles and goes about his business. Charles Ross's story in the East African campaign is one of plunder and bravado, lasting 2 months and a week. This is that story. Before that story, some background. Charles Ross's life begins in 1857 and almost immediately becomes complicated. He was an Australian-born Canadian citizen combat veteran living and working in British East Africa. All these places don't begin to show how well-traveled Charles Ross was. He boasted he was wanted in 3 continents for murder. He had been a Canadian cavalryman in the Red River conflict, immigrated to America as a gold miner and cowboy, at some point attending Santa Clara College, California. But America was much too quiet, and he set sail to South Africa. And the Boer War, he gained a reputation for his ruthless methods of dealing with the Afrikaner combatants. Later, he led a unit of Boers in British Somaliland in hunting down the Mad Mullah's forces. But rather than returning with his unit to South Africa, he instead settled as a game warden in British East Africa. Sometime before the outbreak of hostilities, Ross had crossed into German East Africa. Perhaps owing to his cowboy experiences and his no-rules attitude in life, he and some friends had rounded up 500 heads of native cattle, and were attempting to take it across the border into British East Africa. His scheme to smuggle so many beasts was cut short when the local German district commissioner, Bwana Schultz, and a party of armed German askaris, knowing Ross's reputation, headed him off. A melee broke out between British cowboys and the Germans led by Schultz to have Ross imprisoned for a time, an experience that Ross would not forgive nor forget. For a time, Ross isn't recorded as part of the British war effort. Clashes at Teveda, Ghazi, Mzee, Magadi, Kissi, before the British defeats at Longido and Tenga. During these early clashes, Ross and a pair of his friends were given commissions, but no orders. It is in the aftermath of these reversals that Ross's scouts finally appears in the sources. The day after the retreat from the Battle of Longido, on the 4th of November, 1914, Ross offered himself and 40 of, to quote, of the hardiest characters in the colony to help in its defense. Headquarters in Nairobi immediately granted it and ordered him to reinforce the border, given the rank of acting major. On the rules, the unit was meant to be part of the East African Mounted Rifles, but Ross and his friends would act independent and never operated with the East African Mounted Rifles. Rather than link up with their unit, they went to Suna and Butindi to help reinforce E Company's 4th King's African Rifles under Major Knox. The unit included Lieutenant J.J. Drought, or Goatee Drought, because of his unit famous beard, who was the unit paymaster and quartermaster, Corporal William Allen, who had many skills in gathering intelligence, Private Gray, who would later become a lieutenant in the 2nd King's African Rifles, the other commanding officer being H.R. Paice, a fellow Canadian-born expat in British East Africa. Ross, after arriving at Kisumu, rode south to Kissi. As his men rested their mounts and took a break before continuing south, Ross learned that the German District Commissioner Schultz was just opposite him across the border, organizing for future raids into British East Africa. He quickly bought the biggest male goat he could find, killed the goat, and shipped the scrotum with a note by native runner to Schultz, who was recovering at Sheriati. The note related to Schultz from Ross expressed his intent to do the same that he had done to the goat to Schultz. On the 17th of November 1914, Ross's scouts and E Company of the 4th King's African Rifles under Major Knox went on to establish Suna and Butindi camps. The pair of majors quickly came to an agreement that Knox would look to the defense of the camps while Ross would take to the offensive and raid the enemy. While most military units in camp or barracks take the time to drill, Ross's scouts did not. Colonel Remington from the King's African Rifles even dispatched a drill master to lick the unit into shape. Arriving, the man began screaming commands to Ross's men. Major Ross jumped out of the tent and began verbally outshouting the man. The drill master ran back to Nairobi, and Ross kept a friendly and relaxed disposition to his unit. South of the Mara River, sections or squads of the 7th and 14th Feld Companies were attempting to organize a raid into British East Africa. At Sheriati, Schultz, who had been wounded in the arm during the parade at Kissy during the action a few months prior, was trying to play his part to make these raids a possibility. When the runner arrived with the goat scrotum and a note for Schultz, the district commissioner read it. The story goes that he immediately packed his things and traveled non-stop to Lindi, 1,800 kilometers, as far as he could. On the 28th of November, 1914, Ross's scouts rode into Sheriati to find the Germans gone. They, for lack of better terms, raided the town until a British steamer began to shell said town. Ross's scouts returned to Butendi camp the next day with their loot. The next recorded raid was on the 1st of December. Ross led a 50-man strong 4th King's African Rifles and some police askari to raid the German town of Susuni. The Germans, though, were waiting. A close-quarters engagement took place. In the confusion, British East African Police Lieutenant Bowen and 2 of his askaris were quickly felled, as are some of the Germans. Rifle fire continued throughout the remaining daylight, only being able to disengage when darkness came. Although relatively light on casualties, the action was beyond Ross's orders to reinforce the border. At some point in December, Ross's scouts made their way to Musuma and raided the German town, taking what they could carry and shooting anyone that they could see in the town. Not an operation or behavior becoming a British officer. It wasn't until the shooting of Missionary Palm, which Major Knox relayed to his commanding officer, did command intervene. On the 13th of January, 1915, a company of the 2nd Loyal North Lancashires and General Stewart came to the area. The general at Kisumu interviewed both Major Ross and Lieutenant Paice. As a result of these interviews, General Stewart disbanded Ross's scouts and took both Ross and Paice's resignations. Most of the rough fellows followed suit. The more military-minded did not. Famously, Lieutenant Drought was transferred to E Squadron, East African Mounted Rifles, but he too quickly formed his own unit, Drought's Scouts, who will get their own video. Others, like mentioned before, took up various roles for the remainder of the war. Ross laid low for a time until his friends in the 25th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, gave him a role in the intelligence section of the battalion. He would even follow the battalion back to England in 1917. As an aside, I made this video with sources listed below. If you're perceptive, you'll notice They're Born to Fight by Neil J. Speed is not included. It looks like an excellent book. I hope to obtain a copy at some point, but at the date of recording this, my channel is not monetized, and at this time is more of a hobby. The only one I could find was 140 Australian dollars. Once a copy comes into my possession, I will be happy to upload a corrected video. To that effect, please like, subscribe, and share. Every little drop of water helps in Africa, as does every interaction with this channel. Cheers all.